All right, welcome everyone to our first virtual workshop experience. I know this is not ideal, but bear with me and I'll try to help you out as much as possible. So if I notice a lot of questions, a lot of emails, you guys can always contact me at my email or text me, call me, contact me in any way, let me know what questions you have, and I'll try my best to answer those questions in workshops and try to get these out as much as possible to help us through this tough time. All right, so this week we are focusing on the evidence of evolution. So we know at this time that evolution is merely the change in a species, the change in its gene pool, and it is a scientific theory. So the scientific theory is different than a common theory in that it is based on facts. So it's very factual, and that those facts are collected through these forms of evidence. The evidence of common ancestry among species comes from many sources. So our first objective question from our notes asked us about those sources. So we have four main sources: fossil evidence, geographical evidence, embryological evidence, and anatomical evidence. And these images show the development of the modern day whales. And we see the forms of evidence in fossil based, in our embryological, anatomical with vestigial, and molecular. Geographical doesn't really apply to the whales as they're in the ocean, so they're not really isolated geographically, as we would see in the finches later on and in other species that we talked about last week. So the evidence that whales descended from hoofed mammals is supported by these forms of evidence. So fossils found in deeper and therefore older rock layers were more primitive. So when you look at the crust, there are layers. The lower layers, the deeper you dig, the closer to the center. That's what we're talking about lower. They are going to be the ones that have the more primitive uh, rock, or more, sorry, more primitive fossils. And the deeper you dig, you see uh, organisms such as this, and these are this organism lived about 52 million years ago, and it is an ancestor of the whale. You see that it has hind legs here, so that means that at one point the whale had a common ancestor with hind legs. About 2 million years later, 50 million years ago, we see that they are starting to adapt to a more aqueous environment where they can swim in the water, but they still have those hind legs. But then 10 million years later, about 40 million years ago, you see that those hind legs are very, very small. They're almost um, non existent. And today, you still see the vestigial structure of the pelvis in modern day whales, but it is no longer usable. We'll talk about vestigial structures a little bit later, but that is also a very important form of evidence. Um, So similar features found in the earliest stage of embryonic development provide evidence of a common ancestor. And you can see this embryological evidence discussed down here. This is an embryo of a whale, and you see that it has nostrils as well as hind leg bud. So that means it's got a little bit of a bud down here for a hind leg, which they don't need any longer, but a common ancestor did, as well as they have a nostril, which they don't breathe out their nose. So once again, that is a vestigial structure in the embryo. And if you look at up on Google, the embryos of a bunch of different organisms, from amphibians through humans, just about anything that is a vertebrate, it is going to have very similar embryo development. And we can show that commonality as evidence that there was a common ancestor, and at some point, each one of the species diverged to create a new organism to fit a new niche. So, studying the anatomy of different organisms reveals homologous structures in some species. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. But here we're talking about vestigial structures, which provide evidence of evolutionary relationships, such as the pelvis of whale, which no longer need them, or the appendix of humans. And we'll later talk about the wisdom teeth of humans and how those structures that still exist in the organism but are no longer necessary, that make them good form of evidence pointing to a common ancestor that once used that structure. And the molecular evidence is similar to what we saw last week in our cladogram activity when you guys were building those molecular cladograms. Here we see that the hippopotamus is very similar to the humpback whale. Once again, a hoofed uh, terrestrial organism, the hippopotamus, is very similar to its common ancestor, the humpback whale, in this milk protein genes. And last week we looked at the cytochrome C protein, which is in mitochondria, which, as we all know, is what creates the ATP to power our cells and us. Is common amongst most organisms. So whether you're looking at plants or you're looking at animals, all of them have this protein, the cytochrome C. And then the more similarly related the two organisms are, the more they have in common. All right, so the one I didn't talk about is geography, which also affects the evolution of species. So we don't have that here, but for example, islands with different habitats support species that evolved with adaptations for that environment. And we'll see that a little bit more when we're talking about those finches. All right, so getting a little bit more into those vestigial structures. So they're critical evidence of evolution. And they are remnants of organs or structures that had a function in an early ancestor, such as those that pelvis in the modern day whales, that is a remnant of the hind legs of its common ancestor, which was some type of four-legged creature. They are homologous to full-size features and evidence of common ancestry among organisms that share them. Vestigial structures, such as what you see over here with the wings of an ostrich or of a chicken, are organs or structures that are greatly reduced from the original ancestral form and have little or no current use. So they don't have any use for the organism, but the organism still expresses them because they were important or useful to a common ancestor. All right. So possible reason for the variation of Galapagos finches. The answer to this question can vary. One possible explanation is that on some islands, insects might have been more abundant uh, than seeds, or that there might have been less competition for insects than for those seeds. The feeding behavior must have been heritable to become common in the population over time. But as you can see on this northern island, there are more of these large cactus finches, while on the southern island, these are more small tree finches. That's because this uh, large cactus finch comes from the genus Geospiza, which is going to have thicker beaks that are better for breaking thick seeds. So if you think of like an acorn, that's a very thick-celled seed. In order for an organism to eat that, it would need a thick beak to break that. While you have this small tree finch living on the southern island that is in a different genus, the Camara hynus, which is its beak is more built for tearing apart vegetation, such as leaves or grass or fruit, for example. It would have a ability to break into that soft skin and then rip it apart using its strength and its biting force. So bat's wing can be considered both a homologous structure and an analogous structure. So a bat wing is homologous to the forelimbs of other vertebrates, such as the hands of humans and the front limb of a mole. So notice that each of these homologous structures uses the same bones in relation to one another, but they've adapted differently to their different functions. A human forelimb, the hand is used for grabbing and using tools, while bat's forelimb, the wing, is used to fly, and the mole's forelimb is used to dig. So they're all adapted a little bit differently, but they all have the same exact bones in the same in relation to one another. So we can assume that this probably because a common ancestor had that structure. And as these have diverged or differentiated into their new species, they have adapted to their niche, their role, by changing the forelimbs, the size of these bones or the consistency of these bones. Like the mole's forelimb is really thick, short bones for digging, while the humans is more flexible for grabbing things. And the bat wings is very thin and light, so it can fly, but it is also analogous to the wing of an insect because the wings are structurally different, though they perform the same function. So the insect wing is used to fly, and the bat wing is used to fly. Since this, oh, sorry. Remember, homologous structures are the result of a common ancestor, even if they have differing functions, such as the hand of the human, the wing of the bat, and the uh, front limb of the mole. While analogous structures are different, these structures evolved separately and are not evidence of common ancestors. They did not evolve from a common ancestor. So we know that the wing of a bat didn't evolve because other mammals don't have wings. So it does not share that common. Uh, it does not share a common ancestor with a insect such as this fly, or sorry, maybe this is a cicada. But it does not, just because they both can fly does not mean that they share an ancestor that had that trait. It is analogous, and like we said before, Analogous is like an analogy. It's a good comparison. They have uh, the same function, but they were not from the same origins. So wisdom teeth are one of the many examples of vestigial structures in humans because they serve no useful purpose today. The human diet and jaw has changed over many generations, and the wisdom teeth are no longer necessary, much like the appendix. As some of you know from experience, and others will learn, the wisdom teeth can be removed. They are no longer necessary, just like the appendix, as many other structures that are no longer necessary for us today. So, millennia ago, when we were cavemen, we had a much different diet. We had to eat things such as bark and grass when there was not food available. And these molars help break down those very starchy and very large molecules in those forms of food. We needed them as well as the appendix in order to survive. But now that we don't need those types of food, we don't need to eat those types of food any longer, these structures are no longer necessary. So they are vestigial. They are remnants of a structure that was once important, but is no longer necessary for us today. All right, so I hope that helped with those 5 objective questions and help you understand some of those forms of evidence that we use to support the theory of evolution that makes it a fact for us today. So I will keep releasing these periodically throughout the week to help go over the activities you're completing, as well as you will be, as long as we are on break from one another, I'll be going over this. So I hope you guys are staying safe and staying healthy, and I hope to see you guys soon.